it was a lot of highs and a lot of lows, a lot more lows than highs for the most part. And you just have to liken it to your time in the military. Had its highs, had its lows, but most of the time you were quote unquote embracing the suck. There's a lot of that in being an entrepreneur, especially in the very early days.
Welcome to VCEO Magazine, where veterans lead the way. Today, my guest is Mark Harper. Mark was a United States Air Force communications officer, and since leaving the military, Mark has been a marketing executive at Technicolor, the CMO and co-founder of Audeze, CEO of We Are the Mighty, and currently the general manager of Recurrent Ventures' military portfolio of brands, overseeing the editorial and business operations of We Are the Mighty, Task and Purpose, the War Zone, Military Influencer Conference, and Mill Spouse Fest. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's exciting to be here.
In every single one of these interviews, the first question I ask people is the exact same. In 6 words or less, can you describe your personal transition from military to civilian life?
Bumpy with a bit of sunshine.
So let's go back to that first day. All right, your first day getting out of the military. What do you remember most about that day?
Well, I had left the military very specifically to pursue kind of what I was doing in the military over on the civilian side. So my first day out was, I think, in pursuit of moving physical location from Charleston, South Carolina, the Air Force Base there, out to Los Angeles. In the military, I was a communications officer, but I ran, for the bulk of my time in the military, I ran the video flight inside of this thing called Combat Camera. And the Combat Camera Squadron, the first Combat Camera Squadron, was, as the name suggests, we were the eyes and ears, the combat photojournalists that were out there basically documenting every single thing the Department of Defense was doing. The good, the bad, the ugly, humanitarian relief, wartime contingency, military exercises, weapons tests, everything out there. We were the ones that were shooting all of it. And, I was bitten by the storytelling bug. And it's what prompted me to actually leave at about 7 years in and make that departure. So I guess first day was packing a Penske and getting ready to go and being really nervous because I didn't actually have a plan. I just had a destination.
You knew you wanted to get out, but let's ask a little bit on here. How did you envision your first job when you got out of the military?
The entertainment world was so absolutely foreign to me. Like I knew and could, understand how we did productions inside the military.
Mm-hmm.
And I envisioned it was some much larger version of that. We were very scrappy. It was everything from going out with a single shooter to going out with a team of 5, 6, 7 people. But I honestly, I didn't know where I would fit in. I didn't know how I would get there. I didn't know how I would get in the room. And all of the things that I didn't know about what I was embarking on would later kind of come back to shape my path as I moved through trying to define what my world in Hollywood, for lack of better words there, was going to end up being.
So Mark, talking about just how your experience was and how you envisioned it, let me ask another question, because this is ultimately about that transition part for veterans. So the main question I have is, why did you leave the military?
Well, I think much to the chagrin of probably the Air Force, they gave me my perfect job too early in my career. So I loved it so much and I wanted to continue being a storyteller. And now with Combat Camera at my back, I figured I had at least enough experience than any other kid out of film school who's going to go try to do something, anything. And I hadn't defined what that was. I knew the transition was going to be a bit rough because I didn't know any of the waypoints between there. So I ended up in Los Angeles and I realized I needed a unique story to get me in front of really anyone to begin with, and to start asking advice on what could someone with my skill set and experience, what would I be tailored for in entertainment as a whole in Los Angeles? And I found out very quickly I needed to figure out two different camps. One is where I talked about my military experience and I showcased it. And honestly, the other was hiding the fact that I was a military veteran. Um, Here's where these two play out. Los Angeles is very much, at least when I was first entering it, it was about connections, but meeting people for informational meetings about, hey, I was recommended to you by so and so. Let me share a little bit about my past, and perhaps you have someone I could go meet and talk to about that next step of getting from point A to point B, whatever that was going to be.
Mhm.
So I would take the no kidding combat camera, like daily briefs that I was still getting outside in the civilian world. And I would send forward to, I remember there was one executive at NBC, and I said, hi, I'm Mark Harper. I was in the Air Force, combat camera. This is the type of imagery that I was responsible for gathering. This type of storytelling allowed us to show decision makers in the Pentagon what was happening, boots on the ground commanders, what was happening in the streets. Sometimes the stuff would go to psychological operations or just go to for press. And those images were not like graphic or bloody or anything like that, but they were amazing. And picture tells a thousand words. This
Mhm.
would be my calling card. I would get a, who is this guy that reached out to me who was like, what, combat camera? This is incredible. And so half the time it was, come on in. What do you want to do? And I would say, well, I don't know. I was hoping you could tell me what I should do. And they're like, that's not the way this works, kid. If you can tell me exactly what you want to do, I can get you to the next person for that. Well, ultimately, I ended up working or finding my way into the business side of the entertainment world. So a company called Technicolor. And I found out there very quickly that they actually did not care or want to hear about at all anything related to the military. And I entered in at a fairly junior position as my first like real W-2 job in entertainment. And my job was quality control for digital cinema, which was very brand new at the time. And a job posting came out to work in post production on the DVD side. And I went in and they said, why do you think you are even remotely qualified for this? You're the guy that watches videos in digital cinema. And I said, well, a year ago, I was running a team of 89 combat photojournalists deployed across 14 remote locations in Iraq, responsible for moving 20,000 pieces of imagery from an area of no communication whatsoever back through a satellite terminal and constellation to Atlanta, Georgia, where it disseminated throughout the world. I documented some incredible and amazing and profound moments in the war on terror. And while this doesn't show in the work that I've currently been doing, at heart, I'm basically a project manager who has done a lot of work in entertainment, but not properly in entertainment, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
And the feedback that I didn't receive that very moment, but it was back channeled to me was, uh, this guy Harper seems like an okay guy, but feels like this military thing might make him feel entitled to things that he can't actually do. And I realized then and there that there's a pretty big military civilian divide, and the way I presented the information to this HR representative was, very matter of fact. And I even said, and look, I've got report cards. I have these officer progress reports from the Air Force and
Mhm.
uh, awards that are sometimes perfunctory, but sometimes given out for very specific things. And all of these things, I think, dictate or should at least allow me to throw my hat in the ring for a job like this. But it didn't land. It didn't land at all. And it was, a realization that, look, this story is going to work sometimes, but it's not going to work others. And you have to kind of identify that before they identify it for you and pick a lane. And that was a weird awakening.
That sounds like it's really that bumpy spot that you mentioned earlier
It
is when you get
was.
there.
It was. Yes.
It ties so much to things that I've heard talking with different veterans about what their transition was like, where they thought that some skill sets and just finding that right way to match them up with other people. So it's so much in line with that that we hear a lot with veterans. So knowing how to actually match that and know your audience for it and how to customize your story for that. Now, you had mentioned this a little bit earlier about having a compelling story and knowing your audience and how to mix that out. how can others, when they're trying to create that story, especially thinking about, who they might be talking to for employees, how would you recommend others create their compelling story?
It's a big hill to climb sometimes. What my experience early on in the civilian world was they can't do that translation for you. And so your story is about getting through that translation for them by way of communicating a road for them to kind of let you get there. I did a very bad job of that when I was in front of the HR person, but I was able to, in many other different parts of the entertainment world, draw that line for them. Look, I may not have been, and I was working at Paramount Pictures. I had this incredible opportunity very early out there to work on digital marketing campaigns for G.I. Joe, Star Trek, and Transformers. It was a very cool thing to be inside of a studio working on these massive and complex campaigns at the very beginning of digital marketing. But to land that role, it was, okay, military guy, what makes you be part of the digital marketing team, like what we do here? And it really was, well, look, let me help you out with that. At Combat Camera, I was basically doing a version of what we're doing here. We were marketing for the military. We were showing that this particular exercise should be funded next year, and that the general at this major command needs to see what happens at Operation Terminal Fury or what happens at Exercise Cobra Gold. These were marketing campaigns for those exercises to get the funding that would eventually trickle down from Congress. And we wrapped it up in a nice 5-minute teaser trailer. And they're like, okay, you're speaking my language. I get it. Now go sit at that computer and play in Photoshop for the next 7 hours. And I'm like, roger that. So it wasn't always that grandiose. I did manage Optimus Prime's MySpace page. I'm really dating myself at this point. But, this is part of paying the dues in the very beginning parts there out in Los Angeles.
Well, what you talk about, it really sounds like understanding how to translate the business acumen over to it is what you did in the military. What's that same business case and understanding that part for it? Also,
yes,
Optimus
absolutely.
Prime's MySpace. I'll have to go see if I can't find that.
I have what an interesting time to be alive. My best friends were Megan Fox, Bumblebee, and I think a couple of Decepticons, maybe Megatron, or I don't know. But just weird to be, reminiscing about those specific very early days of digital marketing.
Mark, I want to shift a little bit because you do have such a diverse background. And I do know that it is very common for veterans when they get out, they want to try their hand at starting something on their own. And you have some of that experience as well with Audeze. So with your experience, what would you say that people trying to start their hand at starting their own thing, what should they be looking to prepare for?
So I believe the military community writ large over indexes in people that actually start businesses, right? And they fuel the small business engine that is a very powerful component of our economy. I actually had no real aspirations that initially. This Audeze company was a high-end headphone company, and it was partly born out of relationships that I made at Technicolor, and were further refined when I decided to go use the GI Bill and go to business school at UCLA Anderson. And so at UCLA Anderson, I had a homework assignment of build a business plan, and a friend who had been working on a business with no plan. It was around these very expensive headphones. And when I say very expensive headphones, I mean the price point started at $1,000 and went up from there, and we could not make them fast enough out of a little garage in Orange County. There's a very magical briefing that I do about this at UCLA about twice a year, where I talk about the entirety of that rocky road of helping start Audeze proper, get some funding. We raised $4.5 million from Warner Music Group, start the company. It's all the ups and downs of that entrepreneurial world that happened over the course of about 3 years. But what should they be prepared for and ready for? I mean, really that. It is such a mostly thankless task of building a company, and it is every day learning and putting on a different hat to help build something like that. Especially for like how young and junior our entire team of four were that were starting this. Um, it was a lot of highs and a lot of lows, a lot more lows than highs for the most part. And you just have to like liken it to your time in the military. Had its highs, had its lows, and but most of the time you were quote unquote embracing the suck. And there's a lot of that in being an entrepreneur, especially in the very early days. So it's about buckling up and being ready for some real hard times at first, but always with like a sight on the future, the goal, what you're working towards, and just how you get from A to B.
Were there periods when it was bumpy, when you didn't think there was going to be those rays of sunshine?
I mean, ask any entrepreneur, they're like almost no, it's almost always cloudy with a chance of rain almost every single day, especially in the very early stages. Um, the big ray of sun was the verbal commit on the $4.5 million from Warner Music Group in the very early stages, and that was like, oh my goodness, this just changed overnight. Um, the lecture that I do at UCLA is about the 18 months that happened from the yes to the money actually landing in the bank account. So there were a lot of rainy days between that and is it really going to happen? I mean, we thought this was going to be next week. We'll have it in the bank account. We'll be off to the races, and everything we just pitched, we'll be doing. And instead, it was, oh my goodness, $4.5 million 18 months ago doesn't do what it did back then today. So it was a lot of constant reassessing, reevaluating, and trying to just work through those challenges.
I want to go to your next stage after Audeze, where you have then been executive vice president, chief marketing officer, president, and CEO. All of these very high level senior leadership roles as well. My question here is, what would you say is unique about being an executive compared to your time in, say, the military, or even as a co-founder for Audeze?
All those titles there were born out of a second startup called We Are the Mighty, which was, I think, that ray of sunshine that kind of came through. That was a company that was created by the former head of MTV Films, named is David Gale, who had a mission and a purpose to create a platform for the military community to tell stories. And the mission behind it was always to figure out a way to curate and find out from our military community what stories really resonated, and then to elevate those into from the articles and maybe social media stories we were doing up into TV and film. Easier said than done, even when you have the former head of MTV at your back. Those titles you just listed were, born out of the very specific needs for this early stage company. And I would say the difference between them and the military and what I did were shockingly very similar, because We Are the Mighty was almost kind of run as a small military unit. It was almost completely filled in the very early years with military veterans who were all very much focused on and excited to be involved with creating content in a way that hadn't been done. There were Military Times and military.com that were doing written articles, but no one was like coming together to say, what can we put on film, digital video? What can go into social media, which had really just kind of started taking off? How do we build an audience, and how do we get all this? And so all of these different positions were kind of laddering up in terms of overall scope and size of responsibilities inside of it, but really kind of felt like an extension to what that was like. And in many ways, every one of those still had this feeling of co-founder attached to it. Even though I wasn't a co-founder of We Are the Mighty, I played that role as one of the very early executives inside the company that was out there raising money for the company, proselytizing what we were able to do, what we were trying to achieve, working with brands, relationships, and partners to drive revenue and to make sure that the company was a success. And we were acquired in the middle of last year by this Recurrent Ventures company. And so now we went from running We Are the Mighty to those 6 brands that you just outlined. And what's interesting to note is that We Are the Mighty and Task and Purpose, for the 8 years I was just at We Are the Mighty, Task and Purpose was the Coke to my Pepsi. So to finally be in a position now where we're working alongside each other is actually truly amazing.
I say this so often to people is the circles that we encounter in life. You never know quite when they're going to come back around for you. At some point or another, they're going to be there. So, knowing the people in those networks, knowing the different areas around it. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be a week, it may be 18 months or 10 years, but it comes back around.
There's a saying in Hollywood: be nice to people on your way up, because they're the same people you're going to see on your way down. And I've seen that unfold many times, and I have always kept that to heart. I was told that actually by David Gale on day one. He had so many incredible stories for all the incredible films that he had created and all the amazing contacts he had made, and he was just the most nice and genuinely approachable person who deeply cared about our military community. So, sage advice from Mr. Gale.
Well, Mark, thank you so much again for joining us today. That's all the questions I have today. Just wanted to say thank you one more time for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.